The sound of metal doors creaking echoed through the prison hallways, each creak a reminder of lost time. Matthew, a 45-year-old man, slowly stepped out, his cautious steps reflecting the uncertainty of a world he no longer recognized. The cold morning air bit at his skin, a stark contrast to the suffocating confinement of his cell. His eyes, now more tired and deep-set, scanned the horizon for something familiar, but everything seemed strange and distant. The city where he had built his life, career, and family now seemed like a different place. The streets, once as familiar as the back of his hand, now appeared as hostile labyrinths. People passed by him, oblivious to his presence, while he carried the weight of an injustice that had changed him. Convicted of financial fraud, he had lost more than his freedom. He lost faith in justice, in humanity, and most of all in himself. When he arrived home, Matthew hesitated before turning the doorknob. The house, once a cozy refuge, now felt like an empty shell. As he entered, he was greeted by the sound of silence, interrupted only by the echo of his steps on the wooden floor. Dust danced in the beams of sunlight streaming through the dusty windows, creating a melancholy atmosphere. The photos on the wall, which once displayed moments of happiness, now seemed like testaments to a life that no longer existed. He walked slowly down the hallway, each step bringing a memory to the surface. The familiar smell of aged wood mixed with a faint perfume that still lingered in the air brought a bitter feeling of nostalgia. But something was different. Small details he couldn't quite identify, until, as he entered the bedroom, he noticed it. There was a sense of absence, a void he couldn't explain. But he didn't have time to process that. He knew he needed to see her, Isabel, his wife, his anchor amid the storm of the past years. He grabbed the car keys and drove through the city, his hands steady on the wheel, his heart racing. The city looked the same, but he knew that, at its core, everything was different. And he was about to find out just how much. When Matthew arrived at the house where Isabel now lived, a feeling of apprehension washed over him. He parked the car and sat for a moment, observing the house. The facade was familiar, but there were signs of change. A newly manicured garden, fresh paint. He got out of the car and walked toward the door, each step resonating with doubt in his heart. He knocked on the door, and time seemed to stretch until, finally, it opened. There stood Isabel, but the look in her eyes was different. There was a mix of surprise, guilt, and something he couldn't quite decipher. The smile he had expected didn't appear. Instead, she looked at him as if he were a ghost from the past, a specter she never expected to see again. "You're back," she said hesitantly, as if the words were hard to pronounce. Matthew nodded, his voice caught in his throat. What could he say? How could he explain years of pain and loneliness in a simple phrase? They sat in the living room, the silence between them heavier than any words. He tried to start the conversation, talking about the injustice he suffered, how he always thought of her, how he had planned this moment in his mind countless times. But as he spoke, he noticed that she wasn't fully present. Her eyes drifted, and he felt that there was something she wasn't telling him. "There's something you need to know," Isabel finally said, interrupting him. Her words were soft, almost as if she were trying to protect him from the truth. But Matthew felt the blow before she finished. "I'm pregnant." The revelation hit him like a punch to the stomach. He looked at her, speechless, as the gravity of the situation settled in. She was expecting a child, but it wasn't his. His mind started spinning, and he barely heard what she said next. "I met someone," she continued, her voice trembling. "Over the past few years, I didn't know if you would ever come back. I tried. I needed to move on." Every word was a cut, every explanation a new wound. Matthew didn't know if he felt anger, sadness, or just an overwhelming emptiness. All he knew was that the world he had expected to find was in ruins. He stood up abruptly, not knowing where to go, what to do. The tears he had held back for years threatened to spill, but he held them in. "I need to think," he said, leaving the house without looking back. As he walked down the street, her words echoed in his mind. Pregnant. moved on. Someone new. The reality was harsher than he could have imagined. He got back into the car, his hands trembling as they gripped the steering wheel. Nothing made sense. He had lost years of his life in prison, and now it seemed he had lost everything else that remained. Matthew spent the night wide awake, sitting in the armchair in the living room that had once been the center of so many cheerful conversations and moments of affection. Now, the silence of the house amplified his loneliness and the overwhelming sense of betrayal. What should have been a return to normalcy had turned into a living nightmare. He knew he couldn't stay there wallowing in self-pity. He needed answers. The next day, Matthew decided to start investigating what had really happened during the years he was imprisoned. He visited old friends and colleagues, trying to understand how Isabel had moved on and how everyone in the city seemed to accept it so naturally. But the conversations were tough. Many friends had distanced themselves during his time in prison, and those who remained treated him with caution, as if his presence brought an uncomfortable shadow of the past. One encounter in particular was especially painful. He visited Louis, a former business associate he had considered a brother. Louis greeted him with a forced smile, but the words exchanged were cold, distant. During the conversation, Matthew realized that, to many, he was still guilty, despite his innocence finally being proven. The stigma of the conviction seemed unbreakable, like a stain that couldn't be erased. As he dug deeper, it became clear that the city had moved on while he was stuck in time. He realized that he had not only lost years of his life but also the trust and connection with those who once mattered to him. Each discovery left him more bitter, and the sense of isolation grew, surrounding him like the walls of the cell he had only recently been released from. But amid this painful search, Matthew found something he hadn't expected. An old letter hidden among the documents at his former company, addressed to Isabel. The letter, sent by the lawyer who had handled his case, mentioned new evidence that could have led to his release years earlier. Evidence that was discovered and given to Isabel, but that she never used. That piece of paper became a catalyst, transforming Matthew's confusion and despair into a burning determination. He needed to know why Isabel had kept that information from him and left him in prison when he could have been freed much earlier. Back at the house where Isabel now lived, Matthew entered without knocking. The anger boiled inside him, mixed with a deep pain he could no longer contain. Isabel was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, but she immediately stopped when she saw him enter. Her expression, full of surprise and concern, did nothing to quell the storm growing inside him. "Why did you do this?" he asked, his voice hoarse, holding the letter in his hands. "Why didn't you tell me about the evidence that could have freed me years ago?" She paled at the sight of the letter, and her eyes began to fill with tears. "I didn't know what to do," she started to say, but he interrupted her. "You didn't know what to do? I spent years in that cell, not knowing that you had the key to get me out." His voice rose, the pain transforming into fury. "You let me rot in that prison while you went on with your life." She began to cry, tears streaming down her face. "I was scared, I was angry, I couldn't deal with it all. When that evidence came, I was so lost. I didn't want to keep living that life. I wanted to start over, and you were there, but at the same time you weren't." Matthew shook his head, incredulous. "So you just gave up on me? Left me there so you could move on with your life? As if I didn't matter." She tried to approach him, but Matthew stepped back. "It wasn't like that," Isabel said, sobbing. "I thought I was doing what was best for both of us, but now I see I was wrong. I was selfish. I wanted to be happy again." Matthew felt like the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. Her words, instead of bringing clarity, only intensified his pain. He realized that he hadn't just lost years of his life. He had lost his wife long before he even knew it. Without saying anything more, he left the house, leaving her behind with her tears and regrets. The only thing he knew at that moment was that he needed to get away, needed to think. But the answers he had found didn't bring relief, only a deeper pain. Matthew walked through the city, his head filled with conflicting thoughts and his heart heavy with the weight of the revelations. The streets that once offered comfort now seemed strange and hostile, as if he were an intruder in his own life. The letter he had discovered burned in his pocket, a constant reminder of how deeply he had been betrayed, not just by the system, but by the person he loved the most. Without a clear destination, he found himself standing in front of the house where Isabel now lived with Sergio, her new partner. The well-maintained garden and fresh paint only served to heighten the sense of alienation. Everything there seemed perfect except for him, who felt like a piece out of place. He took a deep breath and walked up to the door, knocking firmly. When Sergio opened it, the surprise on his face was evident, but he quickly composed himself. "Can we talk?" Matthew asked, though his tone made it clear it wasn't a suggestion. The two men sat facing each other, the tension palpable in the air. They sat in the living room, Matthew still unable to believe he was facing this situation. "I know you probably don't want to talk about this, but I need to understand," Matthew began. "How did this happen? How did you two?" Sergio, a calm and well-composed man, sighed. "I know it's hard, but things changed while you were gone. I never wanted to replace you, but she was alone, hurting, and over time we grew closer. I tried to do the right thing, but it happened anyway." Matthew listened, but each word felt like a blow. He wanted to hate this man, but deep down, he knew the real betrayal came from Isabel. "She knew she could get me out of there," Matthew said, his voice bitter. "And yet, she chose to do nothing." Sergio had no response to that. The silence that followed was deafening until Matthew finally stood up. "I don't know how to move forward," he admitted, more to himself than to the other man. "But one thing is certain. I can't stay here." Sergio nodded, understanding what that meant. "I'm so sorry for all of this," he said, but Matthew knew that apologies wouldn't change what had happened. Without another word, Matthew left the house, this time with a somber certainty. He needed to leave, to put the city behind him, and find a new way to live. Staying meant drowning in a past that could never be reclaimed. The following days passed in a fog of practical decisions. Matthew began organizing his belongings, packing up what little still held value for him. Each item stored away was a silent goodbye to a life he knew he would never regain. He closed up his old house, the sound of the doors closing echoing like the final note of a chapter that could never be reopened. Word of his departure soon spread through the city. Some people came to say goodbye, but most avoided him, not knowing how to deal with the complexity of his situation. He didn't blame anyone. The truth was, he didn't know how to deal with what he was feeling either. The night before his departure, he returned one last time to Isabel's house. He didn't expect a reconciliation, but he needed closure. She met him at the door, her eyes red from crying. "I heard you're leaving," she said, her voice heavy with sadness. "I have to go," he replied, his voice firm but tinged with resignation. "There's nothing left for me here." She tried to speak, but he interrupted her. "I don't hate you," he said softly. "I may never be able to fully forgive you, but I won't carry hate with me. I just want peace." She nodded, tears streaming freely now. "I just wanted things to be different," she whispered. "So did I," he replied. "But they're not. And now, the only thing I can do is move on." They parted without more words, the silence between them filled with everything that couldn't be said. Matthew returned to his house, knowing it was the last time he would see the place he once called home. The next morning, he left the city, his car loaded with his few possessions and a renewed determination. He didn't know exactly where he was headed, but he knew he needed to find a place where he could start over, free from the shadows of the past. As he drove down the highway, the sun rose on the horizon, bathing everything in a golden light. For the first time in a long while, he felt a small spark of hope. The future was still uncertain, but now he was in control of his own life again. And that, in itself, was a rebirth. The car traveled down the highway that stretched out before him, a straight line that seemed to carry Matthew far from everything he once knew. The memories of the city he left behind were still fresh, but with each mile, he felt the weight of those memories dissipate, replaced by a sense of relief. The past still hurt, but the pain was beginning to fade, giving way to a new determination. He drove for hours, passing through small towns and nearly forgotten villages until, finally, he spotted a place that caught his attention. It was a small coastal town, where the sea gently lapped against the rocks and the wooden houses were painted in colors faded by the sun. There was something both comforting and challenging about the place. Matthew felt that here, perhaps, he could find what he was looking for. He parked the car and set out to explore the town. The salty sea air was a welcome change after the years of confinement and the tension of the past few days. The people he encountered on his walk were friendly but not intrusive, offering him small greetings as they went about their lives. Here, he wasn't a man marked by his past. He was just another traveler in search of a new beginning. Matthew found a small inn run by an elderly couple named Mrs. Carmen and Mr. Manuel, who welcomed him with warm smiles. The room was simple but clean and comfortable, with a view of the ocean that seemed to stretch on endlessly. As he unpacked, he felt a sense of calm he hadn't experienced in a long time. The sea, with its constant and eternal rhythm, seemed to whisper promises of renewal. In the days that followed, Matthew began to adjust to his new life. He found a simple job at a local cafe, something he would never have considered before his imprisonment, but that now seemed fitting. There was something soothing about the daily routine, the casual interactions with the townspeople, and the absence of pressures and expectations. He was no longer the successful businessman nor the wrongly convicted man. He was just Matthew, discovering who he could be without the chains of the past. One afternoon, while walking along the beach, he came across an old cabin for sale, half hidden among the trees. The cabin was small, with peeling paint and dusty windows, but something about it drew him in. He knew he didn't need much, just a place to call his own, where he could finally find peace. With the savings he still had, he bought the cabin and spent the following days renovating it, piece by piece, as if he were rebuilding himself. Over time, he began to make friends in the town, small connections that formed naturally without rush. The people respected his space, but they also included him in their lives in a simple and genuine way. For the first time in years, he found himself truly smiling, feeling like part of something without the need to prove anything to anyone. Matthew knew that life would never be perfect and that the scars of the past would never fully disappear. But there, in that small coastal town, he found a new beginning, a place where he could live without being defined by what had happened. He had learned that sometimes, the greatest triumph wasn't in reclaiming what was lost, but in finding the strength to move forward and create something new. As the sun set on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, he sat on the porch of his cabin, watching the sea. For the first time in a long while, he felt that he was exactly where he was meant to be. And with that feeling came the certainty that, although the road ahead remained uncertain, he was ready to face it.